Tonight, I'm delighted to introduce Liz and my friend Liz, and we're going to be just having a spontaneous conversation, mainly centered on various significant historical events of the past, but also with some pointers towards the future. So, welcome to this podcast, Liz. And we don't really want to give away too much information because this is very much a spontaneous conversation, maybe for friends of Liz and my own friends to link up with and follow. And Liz, um, Liz is one of these people who doesn't have to say, uh, I met the Queen today and she told me not to name drop, because the number of famous people she has met is very, very numerous indeed. But actually, I just want to be a little bit more specific. Liz's father has been involved in the movie industry, and he was one of the people behind the film The Demi Paradise, produced, I believe, in the 1940s, although I can't remember exactly when. Uh, it starred Laurence Olivier, and there are many, many other film allusions that we will hopefully explore. So, Liz, maybe we can start with your father and his film involvement.
Yes. What would you like me to tell you? He was born in Russia, in St. Petersburg, which was then Petrograd at the time. And as his father was a diplomat, an aristocrat, they had to flee, which they did successfully, to France. And from there, he came over to England and went to boarding school in England. And finally, he won a scholarship to Key's College. What's it called? Key's and Gonville now, I think it's called. Key's College, Cambridge, but which he loved. And that was his first real contact with British way of life. And I think really from then on, while he was at Cambridge, he started a magazine called the Europa and wrote articles in it and had friends write articles. And eventually, after he left, which he had to come down early because he didn't have enough money to pay for staying there, he got himself a job at Paramount, which was in Wardour Street at the time, and started reading scripts for them. And while he was doing that, he was actually writing his own.
Mm.
And that's how he got into the film business. But anyway, yes.
Now,
So,
Paramount in London, was that like a branch of Paramount? Presumably it's a branch of the Hollywood company.
yes,
Yes,
definitely.
yes.
Yes. And I mean, at that time, there were only two or three big um, film companies working in England, and Paramount, I think, was one of them. And I'm trying to think of the other one, the big English company. It'll come to me later. But anyway, so he started as a writer, really, and then due to the great Hungarian film producer
Mm.
Alexander Korda,
Mm.
who saw something in him, he eventually ended up producing. And because he couldn't go to war as he wasn't a British subject,
Mm.
he was asked to make films during the war for the British morale.
Okay, if I may pause you. Now, he
Yeah.
probably left Russia around 1918, is that right?
Yes.
And the war that you're referring to, is that the First World War or the Second World? Presumably
No,
it's
the
definitely the
Second
Second
World
World
War.
War. So
Yes.
lots of the action started, I mean, lots of the action in his career started beginning in the Second World War.
Yes,
Yes,
that's right.
yes, yes.
And he was surrounded by very interesting, he had very interesting friends who were also beginning their careers. David Lean, who
Mm.
was a young editor at the
Mm.
time,
Mm.
Michael Balkan, who
Mm.
was also a friend of his, and they wrote quite a lot together for Two Cities And recently I met Michael Balkan's daughter, who
Mm,
was telling me about it. And I didn't know what the two cities were,
mm,
whether they were London and St. Petersburg or London and Paris. But
mm.
she seemed to think they were London and Rome. So
Now,
there was a lot of
yes.
inter sort of connection between all these, especially foreign producers and foreign script writers. There was a lot going on. There was a man called Del Giudice, who was a very well-known producer at the time, who was an Italian, and so there was quite a group of non-British who were
Well,
making
these
British
people were,
films.
they're all in London. Some of them, some of the immigrant people might have been fleeing from the Nazi regime. Is that right?
Um, well, no, because I think people like Alexander Korda, I may be wrong, but I
Mm,
think he arrived here before then.
mm, mm,
And my father didn't flee from Nazi Germany. He
mm,
was also here in the early 30s. He
mm,
was at Cambridge then in
yeah,
the early 30s.
yes, yes.
So, but they obviously were not about to be going back to their countries of origin because everything had shifted.
There
And
were
even,
some,
mm,
there were some, for example, Jewish actresses weren't there who did manage to get away from Nazi Germany in the 1930s, who established film careers in this country. Maybe
I
you're aware of
can't
some of
think
them.
of any except maybe Lily Palmer. And
Mm.
I'm not sure who married Rex Harrison of My Fair Lady fame. But I don't can't think of any others. But I'm sure you're right, Rajit. There
I've only
must
come across one. For example, the actress whose name I don't really remember, who took part in a film called, I think, The Car of Dreams, starring John Mills. Uh, I think that she sounds a bit foreign in that film. I think she was one of these Jewish uh, emigrants who managed to successfully establish herself in the UK.
what was her name?
That's the problem.
Oh, you
I
can't
can't really
remember.
trace it, but
Not Yvonne Mitchell. Was it Yvonne Mitchell?
well, I could I could do the thing that everybody does and check up Google and stuff. But if
Yes.
anybody wants to check out The Car of Dreams starring John Mills, they can find this actress who's the main character in it. So Liz,
Well,
getting back to your father now, any connection with Alfred Hitchcock, for example?
no,
No.
absolutely none. I do remember my mother told me she met him on quite a few occasions, but she didn't find him terribly pleasant for some reason. I don't know why, but she was not very sort of uh, what's the word? Well, she wasn't very complimentary
Mm,
about him.
mm.
I think she found him a bit strange.
So I'm just asking you all because of my limited knowledge from the time. Now, what about, for example, to pick a name of one of the most beautiful women who starred in these 1940s films? What about somebody like Valerie Hobson?
Oh, yes. Well, she was in quite a few films, and actually, I do remember meeting her myself, just short, and her husband, Profumo.
Mm,
And that was shortly before his terrible downfall with
mm,
over Christine Keeler.
mm.
And she was in, I can't think which films she was in of my father's. I'm not sure she was in any, but certainly she was around at the time. I mean,
You
we
might have,
we all knew we knew her quite well.
would you
Mm.
have met her in the 50s or the 60s?
Sorry,
Did you meet her in the 50s or the 60s?
I met her in the 60s actually,
60s.
and
Mm.
I think she was no longer acting then.
No, she
She
was
was
retired.
married to Profumo by then and
Yes. Yes.
devoted to him. And to be fair to them, after his disgrace, and it was a terrible disgrace, he went and worked in the East End of London
Mm.
and, worked among the poor and so on and really redeemed himself
Mm.
hugely. And she stayed with him, which is unusual, really.
So, what role did your father have in, for example, what connection in the film The Demi Paradise, which is the one I'm most familiar with?
Yes, well, do you know, it's awful to say, Rajit, because I am intending to do an evening of my father's films. I've been invited to talk about them at a couple of places, and due to a friend of mine who's been doing the same thing. Uh, and I haven't really, to tell you the truth, I haven't yet gone in depth to about the demi paradise. It's only because I wasn't born at that time. It's only what I remember my parents talking about them and um, how they'd all moved out of London at the time to because the film was being made in Denham Studios,
Mm.
and London was so dangerous, the bombs were dropping, and although you could get there by, I think, almost, I'm not sure, by underground, but it became so dangerous that everybody involved in the film business moved out to be nearer to the studios. Hmm.
Yes. Well, actually, this makes you sound very, very quite young as well, because the film wasn't necessarily made that long ago. It was made in the 1940s.
Yes.
Now, what about John Gielgud? Any connections with John Gielgud, who was around certainly from the late 20s and the
Yes.
30s?
He was never in any of my father's films as as much as you know, as I know, he didn't. But you see, it was quite a small group. So I remember meeting him myself at Terence Rattigan's cocktail parties and
Hmm.
that sort of thing. He would appear,
Hmm.
and he was quite shy.
Hmm.
And I don't know what else to say. I have to say I didn't really speak to him, but he
Now,
was certainly.
lots of great actors um, are quite shy, aren't they? I mean,
Yes,
they can't necessarily play themselves, but they can play other people. But if they're asked to play themselves, or if they're asked to be themselves, they kind of freeze a little bit. Have you kind of? I mean, this is something I've picked up from a few people.
yes.
Is this true?
I think so. I mean, I think the worst case of person that I met who just could hardly spoke at all was Peter Sellers. He
Hmm.
came for dinner one evening and he was so tongue tied, you couldn't have believed that he would be this so, you know, witty, amusing comedian. I mean, he just was virtually, he was so shy and terrified.
Hmm.
I found it was quite strange. And he had just done a film with my uncle at that point.
Hmm.
So, you know, there was no need. It wasn't like it was total strangers he was meeting.
Now, your father, didn't he do a film called Mon Oncle or something? Did you mention something
No,
like that?
Mon Oncle was a film made by Jacques Tati,
Hmm.
the great French comedian, who was in fact Russian.
Hmm.
His real name was Tatyev.
Hmm.
But my uncle had the distribution rights in Great Britain.
Hmm.
And so all Jacques Tati's films, which were very popular, Mon Oncle in particular, um, you know, they were distributed through my uncle's company.
And you also had some interesting things to say about David Lean. For example, we know that he didn't necessarily treat his Indian wife very well, but he was
Yeah.
a fantastically great director, wasn't he?
He was an amazing director, and I think mainly because he was such a supreme editor.
Hmm.
His love, the love of his life was really editing. He was above all, I would say, probably the best editor of all time
Hmm. Hmm.
in term, and he just adored the cutting room. And you know, this it isn't just me saying that. I mean, any of his interviews, you will hear how important it was to him and how he actually um, he 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 visualized everything in terms of cutting
Hmm.
when he was actually shooting these films.
Hmm.
But he was a strange man again, very strange. He'd been brought up as a Quaker, and he was very, very, how can I say, that sort of. abstemious in every way with himself
mm,
and so forth. You know, he was not flashy or showy or any of those sort of things, and very disciplined.
mm,
Yeah.
mm. Now, I think that one of the best examples of his editing is the scene where he's in Lawrence of Arabia, where Lawrence is basically talking to one of his colleagues and blowing out a match. And at the instant Lawrence blows out the match, you can see the desert and the sun rising at that point. So that's a cut from him blowing out the match to the sun
Wow.
rising in the desert, something like that. That's supposed to be one of the famous cuts. But
Yes.
what sorts of examples can you think of? What makes you say that he was one of the greatest editors?
Well, I don't. I can't really tell you because, as he himself said, you shouldn't be able to see that.
Hmm.
If you're a really great editor and cutter, you
Yes.
shouldn't be able to. You shouldn't really notice it at all. But personally, Rajiv, I don't recall the scene that you're talking about, and that's fascinating. But of course, the one that most people will remember because it's been repeated over and over ad
Hmm.
nauseam is the long shot
Hmm.
of the camels
Hmm.
on the horizon going across the desert.
Hmm.
And that has been repeated in every film from, you know, um, all the Spielberg films. They all have soldiers on the horizon. They all have, I don't know, there are endless things now, but he was the originator of that long shot,
Yes.
that particular long shot. The
Um,
person you ought to ask is my brother. He'd be the one to be able to tell you more, as he actually was in the industry himself. I was only a bystander.
yes. Um, so, what about any connection with Alec Guinness? Did you ever
Yes,
like he took
yeah,
part in a lot of David Lean films, and he also went
yes,
on to other things like Star Wars later
yes,
on.
yes. Well, I again not somebody my father had very often John Mills in
Hmm.
his movies, who was a wonderful man, absolutely adorable man, and beautiful actor, in my opinion. And Scott of the Antarctic and all these films that he was in that were
Hmm.
so iconic and wonderful, In Which We Serve, the great wartime film. And but Alec Guinness, who is certainly one of the finest actors, he didn't appear in any of my father's films. And again, my mother said to me he was somebody that she was quite shocked when she met him because he was so rude to his wife and
Hmm.
he was treating her in such a really
Hmm.
unforgivable way. I mean, today it probably wouldn't be accepted at all, the
Hmm.
way he was treating her. And my mother said she couldn't warm to him at all.
Hmm.
But that's just, maybe he was having a bad day. I don't know.
Well, they are buried together in this in the same churchyard, so
Are
that
they?
says
Are
something.
they?
Yes, they are. Yes.
But I mean, she said she'd never come across that before, the
Hmm.
way he treated her, and she disliked him. And my mother was not somebody who took. I mean, she met Marilyn Monroe and adored her. Thought she was absolutely sweet and completely not at all as she was meant to be. This
Hmm.
dizzy, ditzy blonde. She said she was rather clever, but she
Maybe
thought she was.
maybe you want to say a little few more words about this encounter with Marilyn Monroe that your mother had. Was that in London or was that in America?
Yes, they were. Well, she'd come to London to make The Prince and the Showgirl with Olivier,
Hmm.
and it happened to be written by Terence Rattigan, my father's, well, co-writer.
Hmm.
Well, in fact, he always employed Rattigan to write his scripts, but they did write a lot together.
Hmm.
And so I assume it was a dinner party for Marilyn Monroe.
Hmm.
And my mother sat right by her and she said she found her delightful and not at all not at all as she was made out to be. Very sensitive and very intelligent.
Hmm. That's very, very interesting. What are the other films that you might care to mention that come to your mind when you think of your father? Because I'm afraid that uh, my own connections with his films are a bit limited.
Well, if I may, I think I'm kind of going to, I don't want to show off, but um, just recently a friend of mine brought to my attention that the great American producer, um, who is the Italian who did all the ones with Robert De Niro and
All right. Coppola?
no,
No.
no. The
Um,
other one, Gangs of New York.
right. Um, I'm afraid I can't think of that
Uh,
name.
oh, what is his name? Anyway, he's the biggest of the American producers.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
oh, I have to remember his
Let's
name.
let's try and find out. I mean, we can take a tiny little. We're not going to take a pause. We're not going to necessarily because we're trying to keep this as spontaneous as possible. But I think it's worth chasing up. So maybe you want to spend some time chasing it up.
Yes, yes.
Let's try and find out.
Okay,
Um,
we'll take a pause there, shall we? Did you say you want to take a
no, no,
pause?
no, no, no. I think
Oh,
that our listeners can wait a little bit while you
all
chase
right,
it up. Let's just find out.
all right. What do you want me to
Well,
look
yeah,
at?
yeah, yeah. You have to look at your on Google or whatever you want to do.
Okay. Um, I don't know how to go out of here and come
You don't
back.
have to go. Haven't you got your mobile phone with you?
Oh, I've got my
Yeah.
mobile,
So
yes.
yeah, yeah. So let's find
I
out.
can do it on there. Um, okay, Google, who produced Gangs of New York? Martin Scorsese.
That okay. Okay. Yes. Yeah. That's it.
That's who I'm
That's
talking
it.
about.
Right. Yes.
Anyway, he said that one of his favorite films of all time was The Demi Paradise,
Hmm.
which was one of my father's very earliest films that was adapted from the Pushkin Queen of Spades.
Hmm.
No, not sorry, not The Demi Paradise. The Queen of Spades was his favorite film, one of his
Right.
favorite films,
Right.
and indeed he reckoned one of the all-time
Hmm.
favorite 100 films.
The Queen of
Well,
Spades.
Queen of Spades.
Is that a British production or
It
American?
was
Yeah.
with he thought that the director, who's gosh I've forgotten what his name was now, was absolutely brilliant.
Yes.
And anyway, I didn't know that Martin Scorsese even knew about this film.
Hmm.
I knew that it was studied
Hmm.
at the British Film School for the lighting of that time. In the early 30s, it was very, very modern for the time. But anyway, he said it's one of his favorite films.
Are there any other films that you can
What that
consider mentioning
what
with
that he
well that your father was involved with? I mean, like you said that John Mills took part in many of your father's films.
well yes there
Those
were
films.
I mean I what the film that won him the wartime best film of the war, which actually beat In Which We Serve,
Hmm.
was Way to the Stars, which is
Right.
still shown
Yes.
every year
Right.
round about November.
Yes.
um, which had quite a wonderful cast of Michael Redgrave. And the other film, which I think um, the first of the few, which had the wonderful Leslie Howard
Right.
playing the
Yes.
man who built the Spitfires,
Hmm. Hmm.
which was fascinating and
Yes.
very sympathetic, very
I'm
sympathetic.
assuming it's the same Leslie Howard who was a great star who took part in Gone with the Wind and possibly
Yes,
Scarlet
absolutely,
Pimpernel. Yeah, that's one.
absolutely.
Yes,
And
yes.
he also starred in another film of my father's, which actually is one of my favorites. It's not my favorite one of his, which was called Pimpernel Smith.
All right.
And it's it was about the Scarlet Pimpernel,
Hmm.
but it's it was adapted to the Second World War. So instead of the Pimpernel who was
Yes.
he was uh, rescuing people from the French Revolution. In this one, he's rescuing people from during the Nazi regime. Anyway, and Leslie Howard gave a wonderful performance in that. Yeah.
Yes. Many of the best war films were done in the 1950s rather than the 40s. I mean, the 40s were very patriotic, very, very important films that were at the heat of that war period. But in the 50s, there was a kind of like the Dam Busters and that
Yes.
film which has got John Mills in the desert drinking the beer at the very end of it. Those sorts
And
of films.
Ice Cold in
That's
Alex.
right. That's right.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Now, did your father's career extend into the 50s?
It did. He did make it. Oddly enough, I think what you're saying is I can't I haven't got it to hand, but I think he made a film that was sort of post-war that was about the war too, but I can't remember which one it was. Whether it was the one with Leslie Howard about the Spitfire,
Hmm.
the man who designed Spitfires,
That might
or
have been slightly post-war, mightn't it? Because
yes,
because the Spitfire played a big role in the Second World War itself,
that's right.
but its
So I
importance
think,
would have been recognized afterwards.
yes, I
Yeah.
should have got out my list of his films and the dates that he made them.
Well, I mean, another film
Because,
that comes into my head from the 50s, which was quite famous, was I think it was The Cruel Sea with Jack Hawkins. It actually turned Jack
yes,
Hawkins into a star.
yes.
Any connections with Jack Hawkins or anybody like that?
I think he did appear in one or two of my father's films. The interesting, there was a story I remember. He he had cancer of the
Yes.
larynx later on, and
Mm, mm,
he had to have an operation that took out most of his
yes.
throat thing. And before that, there had been an actor who, I think he was Charles Gray,
Mm,
who he almost sued because he said he had the same voice.
mm,
But it turned out that he turned out to be a total blessing
mm.
because in the end, he would do the voices for Jack
All right.
Hawkins.
Wow. That's
Yes,
very interesting. Um,
yes,
so, I mean, I can pick up some kind of Russian connection in the film The Queen of Spades that your father was part of. To what extent did Russian culture influence your father's films? Presumably, he was also a Russian speaker.
yes. He
Yeah.
was a fluent Russian speaker, which is surprising given that he actually left Russia when he was 8 or 9, but he never forgot it. And
Mm,
he and his brother Dmitri, who was also a film producer who did many films as well, but later on, um, like The Millionaires and a few others, uh, quite a few others. Um, they always spoke it together. Well, I think the one that you mentioned, the Demi Paradise,
mm,
that was the British government asked him to make that film because it was just after the Russians had changed sides
mm,
from being allies of the Germans. They then became our allies, I
mm,
mean British and American allies, and the government wanted some vehicle so that the Brits would understand that the Russians were now on our side.
mm,
And so that is why he made the Demi Paradise. And at the movie, at the premiere, Churchill turned up and his wife, Lady Clementine Churchill, and Monty. My
mm,
mother told me very proudly they were all there.
mm.
So it must have been quite an important thing for, you
Yes.
know.
Yes, yes, yes. I think it's a wonderful, I mean, it's a classic era, the 40s and the 50s in terms of British films, or at least a strong relationship between Britain and America in the films that came out at that time. Um, so any other Russian connections? Because I mean, Russia is very, very culturally rich, one of the most culturally prolific countries in the world. Not many people recognize that they've got lots of classical music, lots of poetry, lots of plays, and a lot of that kind of got destroyed during the revolution. But
Yes.
maybe your father carried some of that aristocratic stuff along with any lots of other Russians who fled, carrying all their treasures with them, metaphorically and literally, out of Russia after the revolution.
Well, I think Rajiv, what it gave him was that I know that his own father was determined not to be a sort of Russian emigre in Paris, sitting there saying, when we go back, you'll be foreign secretary and you'll be this and that, and weren't they wonderful times? So my father had none of that. But I think what it did give him was the ability to be an outsider looking at the British.
Mm,
I mean, if you aren't somebody from the country you're living in,
mm,
you never feel quite one of them,
mm,
uh, and so you have this um, ability to look more closely and look with a different eye on the country which has become your your where you live.
mm,
He never took out British nationality, which gave him a lot of hardships because he had what they call a Nansen passport,
mm,
and it was given to many Russians. The diplomat, the Norwegian diplomat Nansen, who had
mm,
also been an explorer, you probably know of him. He was at the same time as Amundsen. Anyway, he decided that all these Russian emigres should have passports because they then didn't have any. And so this Nansen passport was produced. Well, of course, it gave a lot of problems post-war when we used to go on holiday to France or Italy or wherever,
mm.
and the Swiss were very particular about passports, and it would take hours of them going through this thing. Anyhow, so I think he had a great attachment to Russia, but he didn't actually portray Russians in his films. Funnily enough, he had more a thing about Germans,
Mm,
and he always, throughout his movies, he always had a character called Schwarzbach,
mm,
which he tried to get in this character in every film he did. And sometimes I remember him reading out something to me with Schwarzbach, and I'd say, that isn't funny. And he'd go, you don't think so? And I'd go, no, not at all. So he'd have to go back and do it again. And he does put him into, he finally finds a little place for Schwarzbacher in the yellow Rolls Royce. He turns out to be a
mm,
diplomat
mm.
at the dinner party that Rex Harrison and Jean Moreau are giving before the Ascot.
Your father grew up in Russia, did he?
Grew up,
Yeah,
well, to the age of 8 or 9.
which
He
is not
was,
insignificant. I mean, it has quite an impact.
yes,
And
yes.
did he speak English with a slight accent, probably?
Well, I don't think he did, but some people say he did. You
Right.
can see him on, there's a clip of him accepting the Daily Mail award
Mm,
in 1944 on
mm,
YouTube,
mm.
and you can see for yourself what you think.
He might have perfected an impeccable H, for example, because the H is not a very H is the letter H is not particularly pronounced quite like that in Russian. It's a
Yes,
ha sound, but
yes.
presumably your father had a perfect H.
Well, I think he did. I think he
Yes,
did. And also, he spoke perfect French too.
right. Well, that was a language of the
Yes,
aristocracy, wasn't it, in
yes,
Russia as well? So maybe he
yes,
received some kind of French education in Russia.
yes. It was, in fact, my grandmother didn't speak English. She spoke very good, she spoke perfect French, which
Hmm,
is what my brother and I always spoke with her in French because her English was rather poor. And of course, she spoke Russian as well.
hmm.
And my
So
grandfather spoke German very well, of course, because he was originally a Balt.
moving towards a slightly more kind of modern age, I'm thinking of people like Rex Harrison and James Mason, who were dominant from, shall we say, the 60s to the 70s, and they probably had their prime probably even earlier than that. But they did come into their own in many of the films in the 60s and later on.
Yes.
But did you have any connections with, for example, these two characters, Rex Harrison and James Mason, or any
Yes.
of this that kind of
Well,
ilk?
well, Rex Harrison was in quite a few of my father's films, including the Yellow Rose Royce, which was my father's second to last film,
Hmm.
and he was in that, and he was in one or two others. Anyway, we knew them very well, and his second wife, who died, who was the one that everybody loved, who was in Genevieve. What
Hmm.
was her? I've forgotten what her name was.
That's
Um,
yeah. That's all
and
right.
sorry,
That's okay. That's okay. It's not
yeah,
really germane to our
but
conversation.
um, so so he was in the Yellow Rose Royce, which he did shortly after um, My Fair Lady,
Hmm.
and was terribly careful about his clothing. He was very meticulous about what he wore for the movie and so on.
Hmm.
And I can't tell you really much. I can't think of any other Rex
Well, I
Harrison
can
stories.
think of another character who you have had some connection with, I believe, Joan Fontaine. I know we're kind of going backwards in time again to talk about Joan Fontaine. I mean, remarkably, she lived until quite recently. But you do have some, I mean, you do know these people quite a lot, don't you? These sorts of
Well,
actresses and actors.
weirdly, when we were living in Hollywood, my mother was great friends with Olivia de Havilland.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And I remember going out to lunch. I was only a teenager, and I went out to lunch with them both, and they absolutely looked like sisters.
Hmm.
It was incredible. I mean, they were like twins almost at that point. And I didn't meet Joan Fontaine, but I saw her coming out of the Beverly Hills Hotel one evening, totally drunk. And
Hmm.
it was really sad because, she had been a great actress and she was very dark haired and didn't look a bit like her sister.
Hmm.
And it was well known that they had this rivalry and were not very good friends. But I was amazed at how my mother uh, and Olivia de Havilland looked absolutely identical. And at that point, and she was married at that time to the head of one of the big French magazines. I can't remember which magazine it was. So she lived in Paris mainly, Olivia de Havilland,
Hmm.
by then.
When were you in Hollywood?
In the early 60s.
Hmm.
And as you know, I met Elvis, which
Hmm.
was, for
Actually, I don't
me,
know that.
was, oh, well, that was my biggest
Hmm.
thrill.
Okay.
I'm one of the few people that I know who not only met Elvis, but had a photograph taken with him, and he signed it for me,
Hmm.
and with my brother as well.
Hmm.
And so I always say I met the king.
Hmm. Well, I'm just trying to think of any things that strike me from the 70s. I mean, the one thing that, sorry, the 60s, the one thing that comes to my mind was that's the time when the James Bond films started, I think, but they actually started towards the end of the 60s.
Yes.
So I think it was like Sean Connery, maybe he might have been the first Bond.
Yes.
Any any connections with, well, Julie Andrews or Sean
Well,
Connery?
my brother was on several of those Bond films,
Right.
and in fact had the honor of being able to wear Sean Connery's clothes when the shooting finished. They were the same size.
Mm,
And one of my dear friends, Sylvan, she's the one who really knows about Bond.
mm,
You'll have to get her on your podcast because her father wrote the very first Bond film.
mm,
So she has a lot of Bond people interviewing her. It's a whole nother world of Bond people. But my brother did quite a few films with Sean Connery, and my uncle did a film with him with Brigitte Bardot. I can't remember what it was called now.
mm,
In They shot it in Spain in Almeria. It was a cowboy film.
And do you have any favorite actors or actresses, including people that you might have encountered?
Well, I actually did really love Dirk Bogart's work,
Hmm.
I have to
And you've
say.
met him as well. You've talked to him.
I've met him,
Yes.
and he was in several of my father's films. Probably my favorite of my father's films was a film called Libel,
Hmm.
and he was in that with Leslie Carroll,
Hmm.
who I met recently, who no, that was the Doctor's Dilemma she was in with him, which was an adaptation of Bernard Shaw. So,
Yeah.
incidentally, my mother told me one of my father's very first film uh, was a Bernard Shaw adaptation, and she said she actually met him. She was about 18, and he said to my father, and this nobody will ever know except you will now know and your podcast friends.
Hmm.
He said to my father, if I was a young man now, I'd be writing for movies. That
Wow.
is
Yeah.
Bernard Shaw.
Yes. Yeah. Well, he had the wonderful privilege of living well into the 50s, and he had a huge,
Yes,
long, wonderful life.
yes.
Um, so he had a good
This was
lifespan.
a film in the 30s, Pygmalion, and that was with it, I think Rex Harrison was in that,
Hmm.
possibly. Wendy Hiller, the great Wendy Hiller. It won 2 Oscars for the its script, that film.
Yes. Yes. So interestingly, so I'm just going to start saying a few things about Liz without necessarily being explicit. Liz has moved in a bit of a spiritual direction in her life, and this may or may not coincide with some of the film connections she had, but one way or another, forces convene to move her in a kind of spiritual direction. Have you made any spiritual connections with people in the cinema industry, or have you noticed some kind of trend towards this kind of spiritual direction, uh, with a kind of link to what was happening in the cinema as well?
Um, well, I think that there are an awful lot of young actors and actresses who meditate.
Hmm.
And one of my dearest friends, Hayley Mills, she is meditates. She was a she was following the uh, Hare Krishna people. I don't know what they call that.
Hmm.
But and we know so many like Richard Gere,
Hmm.
who are who are dedicated Buddhists, and I, it's a very I think it's a very big part of creative people's way of grounding themselves.
Hmm.
Uh, uh, and there's certainly much more talk about these sort of things
So
now.
it's not just a cult or a fad then.
Oh no, I think people in the film industry, actors and actresses, they really do feel great benefit from having this in their lives because it is, I mean, unless you're one of the top actors and actresses, it's a very precarious life.
Hmm.
So I think the idea of, impermanence is and grounded in some spiritual thing is really helpful.
Hmm.
Well, not only helpful for us, but I mean helpful for them in their work.
So just to kind of maybe digress a little bit, any connection at all with George Sands or George Sanders?
Oh, you
Yeah, the one,
mean
that one, the one who took part in Jungle Book, and he was the voice
oh
of
yes, I
Indra.
met him in Los Angeles. Of course, he was another Russian. He
Was
was
he?
actually
Hmm.
Russian.
That's very
Yes.
interesting.
So
I didn't know that. His name doesn't sound Russian.
no, it doesn't, but he was. He was actually Russian, as was Natalie Wood, who I actually
Hmm.
heard her speaking in Russian
Oh,
in
wow.
Hollywood
Yes.
one evening with some Russian friends I was with. Peter Brook's wife, Natasha Parry, who was an actress, one of the 10 most beautiful women in the world at one moment. And we were in a we were having dinner somewhere, and we were leaving, and Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner were there, and they went. She went up to them, and the two Natashas, they spoke together in Russian.
That's extremely interesting. Очень интересно, I should say.
Да, хорошо. It's true. And
Well,
this is
that's
true.
extremely interesting. Yes. So George Sanders had perfect English. You know, he was actually
Yes.
he spoke
Well,
English better than English people.
well, that's what I say. And I
Yes.
think that was the sort of, I feel my father spoke in a similar way, maybe too perfect, it's almost too perfect. But I know that George Sanders was definitely, well, he may not have been Russian. Now I think about it. I'll have to look it up.
He's
Maybe
probably
I'm,
got a connection. We've got to check it up.
yes.
Yes. Yes.
He's definitely Slav. He was
Right.
definitely Slav.
Well, he certainly, I mean, he comes across as the epitome of the English gentleman, you know,
Well, that's right.
he
And
does.
and he
Yes.
was always cast as the epitome of Englishness.
Yes. Yes. Maybe with something a bit dark about him as well.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Yes. Yes. So, so coming, I'm afraid that, I mean, the movie industry went into a kind of abeyance in the 1970s. I can't think why exactly, but there was a kind of a abeyance, and it wasn't anything to do with um, videos, because that abeyance took place later on when videos came along. Um, but but that kind of golden age of Hollywood did decline towards the 70s, and maybe it experienced some kind of resurgence later on. But why do you think it seemed to decline in the 70s?
Well, I partly think because the Hollywood studios started to really struggle,
Hmm.
and they overspent on on you know many films like Mutiny on the Bounty, Cleopatra.
Hmm.
All these films were hugely, they overspent on them and didn't get their money back,
Hmm.
and they began to go into decline. And um, the great Hollywood moguls,
Hmm.
all those all those Louis B. Mayer and all those other people, I can't think of them now who they were. They'd all passed away, and it began to be accountants and people who were running
Hmm.
these studios rather than creative people. And I think that got them into big trouble.
Hmm. Hmm. So now I just want to talk about two famous people who died in the 60s, and you must have been familiar with where you were and what you were doing at that time. So James Dean.
Yeah. Well, I don't know much. I mean, I don't. Of course, he's one of the great young actors of that time, but I don't actually have any stories to tell you or anything of any interest really, because I never met him, or other than seeing his films. I didn't meet Elia Kazan either, is the director that he always was
Hmm.
directed by
Hmm.
until his death.
You
Um,
see, one of the things I find very intriguing about James Dean is that his death was apparently predicted by Alec Guinness. And Alec
uh,
Guinness had looked at James Dean and looked at his car and said, if you get into that car, you're not going to live very long. Something like that. It's supposed to be quite true that Alec Guinness warned James Dean about his car. But where were you when this news came out? It must have been, was it a gigantic, what you call headline news
I
when you
think I
heard that?
was quite young at the
Oh, right.
time.
Okay.
I think I may have been at
Yes.
school because I
Right.
don't remember it. It didn't impact on me
Mm,
anything like,
mm.
you know, later Elvis's death or something like that.
Right.
Didn't
Right.
have a big impact on me, I have to say.
Yes. What about the Kennedy assassination?
Yes, now that I do remember that. Um, I never, for some reason, I never did anything like babysitting or anything like that as a young teenager. But this particular evening, I babysat for a friend of mine, uh, not a friend of mine, but the mother of a friend of mine,
Mm,
and I remember it terribly well. And I was on my own and
mm,
watching this, and it was just so shocking. We were all so shocked.
mm.
It was very similar to Princess Di's. It had the same sort of effect in the sense of, it was a global disaster, really.
So this was kind of coming towards the height of the Cold War. I
Mm.
mean, it carried on quite strongly from the 50s onwards. Um, did you find any kind of alienation or estrangement in your head with the fact that you've got these Russian connections and the Russians were perceived as the enemy by
Well,
West, by the West,
yes, in a
by the West?
way. In a way, I think, yes, Rajit, I think so, because um, um, people had such a strange idea about Russian people. You know, they equated the government with the whole of the Russian populace, which, as we know, is not like that at all. They're warm
Mm,
and kind of rather anarchic and unpredictable and so forth. And yet, that's not at all how people viewed that Cold War era of all those old leaders, Brezhnev and
mm,
all those other people who came, and it was quite difficult actually as early on to say that I was partly Russian
mm,
because people thought you're either so exotic it's not true,
mm,
or you're an enemy in some way.
mm. But you probably aren't necessarily that attached to, for example, Russian food or Russian culture or anything especially to do with Russia. I mean, after all, you're not Russian yourself necessarily. You were born in Britain, weren't you?
Well, yes, but I had quite a Russian, in a way, I had quite a Russian enculturation because I was brought up as a Russian Orthodox,
Yeah.
and so Russian, all the Russian calendar, the Russian Easter, Russian Christmas, which is always a week behind British Christmas, those were all celebrated, and I had grandparents who were very Russian,
Mm,
and so I feel I had quite a lot of, and I was always taken to, if the Russian ballet came to Britain, I went with my parents who automatically would go to see some whatever it was, and I remember having to sit through Boris Godunov in the days when they didn't have subtitles above the operas, and it was absolutely awful having to sit through this when I didn't speak Russian,
mm.
and it was
Have
hours long.
have you met Nureyev, or has anybody that you know met Nureyev, Rudolf Nureyev?
Um, well, only tentatively. I didn't meet Nureyev. No, I wish I had, but I knew some South American people who were very friendly with Margot Fontaine and Nureyev at the time.
I
But
mean,
that was
yes,
after my father had died, so I didn't have much connection with.
it's very interesting how many Russians were defecting whenever they could um, from Russia to the West, and lots of cultural figures from Russia did defect to the West. I can only
Yes,
think of, for example, I can only think of people like Nureyev and that very famous Russian film director Tarkovsky.
yes.
Um,
Well, and Stravinsky, who went, uh, the Russian, um, what's his name? The I met him in New York. The ballet, uh, the wonderful choreographer, Balanchine,
uh,
another Russian, um, Balanchine, um, Stravinsky, even Rachmaninoff, I think, didn't he end up
yes,
in
yes, he
New
did.
York
He did.
living there?
He did. Yes.
And then Nabokov
Mm.
and many Russians, yes, came out of Russia. They couldn't because they couldn't be creative
Yes,
without
yes, yes.
that
Now,
atmosphere.
it's quite interesting you're talking about the Russian Orthodox Church, which is actually which has maintained its traditions and its strength quite a lot. Despite communism, it has come back with vengeance now. Um, But I feel that the depth of spirituality in the Orthodox Church didn't necessarily hold you back from, basically, it probably it fed your spirituality, didn't it? Do you think? Yes, I
Well,
would imagine it fed it some way.
yes, I
Yes,
think so. I think so. I still occasionally will go because for me the music and the actual spectacle is very, it's very powerful, has a powerful effect. And I
yes,
just
yes. I'm just trying to check out. I'm trying to remember. I can't remember this piece, but one of Tchaikovsky's lesser known pieces happens to be some kind of choral piece
yes,
for on behalf of the church.
yes, yes.
Um, so so
I
in
can't.
what yeah so what prompted you to as it were, not necessarily leave Christianity, but take up something connected with meditation?
Well, it's actually was because in the Orthodox Church there is the tradition of confession,
Mm,
and unlike the Catholic Church, you don't go into a box. You actually see the priest who you're confessing to.
mm,
You're in front of him on your knees, and he puts a thing. And I used to just get in a terrible state over it,
mm,
and felt such terrible guilt and shame. And I couldn't. I found that terribly difficult to deal with it. It
mm,
just was there in a very, very powerful way, and it just didn't help me. And I thought I need something spiritual, but I don't know quite what. And so I started to go to the meditation classes, and there I heard, you know, that it was all about being skillful,
mm,
having skillful means rather than bad or good.
mm,
And that seemed to really let me off the hook
mm.
in some way in my deepest being.
Yes,
And
that's very interesting. I want to ask you more specifically. I mean, we have seen a kind of inversion or a dramatic change in morality and the perception of morality in Western culture from the 40s and the 50s to now. Uh, I mean, things have become extremely, I don't want to use the word permissive, but that's the first word that comes into my head. And actually, I'm actually I'm very open and interested in this kind of shift in morality. For example, things like adultery and homosexuality and things like that. Those lots of laws and restrictions to do with those sorts of things and other things connected with them have changed now.
yes,
Um, how do you view this change? I mean, speaking objectively, without necessarily having too many opinions, it's very interesting, this kind of shift in morality. For example, you're somebody who lives in Thailand and you observe, or you work in Thailand, you observe something about the morality of the Thai people, for example. Um, what can you say about this shift in morality, if anything?
well, I do think it is very, very um, impressive how how tolerant people are in Thailand of gender uh, difference, much more than here. And having said that, of course, I'm of an older generation, and
Mm,
it's always difficult when you're from another generation
mm,
to adapt to newer norms.
mm,
I do find it very difficult
mm,
to go with all these sort of, like today I was listening about um, neutral lavatories.
mm,
They're trying to get rid of female and male
mm,
lavatories in which is really hard to get my head around because
mm,
personally I've been brought up with male and female
mm, mm,
lavatories, and so to go into somewhere where there are men and women and gender,
mm,
um, I don't know what you LGBT
mm,
people,
mm,
it's quite difficult to, for me personally, to adapt to that. But when I see the way people are in Thailand, I
mm,
think it's remarkable and very, um, it's a very big lesson
mm,
of how well they take it and how they're not at all disturbed by it. Having said that, people are not as aggressive
Mm,
there.
mm.
They don't have such. They don't seem to have such stands on, such views on it. Very, very forceful views that people seem to have here.
Yes, that's very, very interesting. And part of this is obviously um, the subject of a different sort of conversation. But it's very interesting that you have sampled now Russian culture, Western culture, Hollywood, and now Thailand. And
Yes,
I think we've also seen this profound shift in possibly aspects of morality and values in recent times. Um, so overall, I mean, you seem to have had a very, very rich life, and certain things in recent times have probably enriched it even more,
yes,
not least with regards to things like spirituality and ethics.
yes.
So, um, presumably, you're somewhat optimistic, are you?
I am. I am, on the whole, I'm optimistic. I actually think, in many respects, it's a much kinder world today, much more inclusive. And, I think about something like the Paralympics.
Mm,
People just didn't even notice people that were disabled, or they tried to pretend they weren't around.
mm,
And the same goes for gay people.